ninth part of the lectures on understanding Islam, unpacking the Dhimma pact. We're looking finally at religious persecution and Islam, and I think many people are aware that it's tough for non-Muslims living in Islamic societies. And the reason for that is the Dhimma pact. The British Secret Service reported in 2007 that 20 million Christians are persecuted around the world today. 4 out of 5 countries where Christians are persecuted, according to the Open Doors watch list, involve Muslims as persecutors. So 80%, if you like, of the persecution is happening in Islamic contexts. And what's more, 80% of Muslim states persecute Christian minorities. So what's going on? Why is it such a big deal? If Islam is a religion of peace and of tolerance, why is the practice not working? Well, the reality is that the persecution of Christians in Islamic contexts universally tracks Dhimma pact regulations. That is, wherever there are abuses, you can tie the individual abuses to Islamic law, to the teachings of Islamic law. For example, restrictions on advancement in public office in countries like Pakistan or Egypt. This relates to the fact that non-Muslims are not allowed to have authority over Muslims, according to the Dhimma pact. Restrictions on building and repairing churches. These are reported in many Islamic countries, from Indonesia through to Egypt. And this is because, in Islamic law, churches are not supposed to be built or repaired after conquest. The Islamic community is meant to be held, the non-Islamic community, the Christian or Jewish community, is meant to be held frozen in time, as it were, unable to advance in any way. The kidnapping and conversion, sometimes marriage of women, is reported in many societies where non-Muslims are a minority. And as I've explained, this is one of the results of the Dhimma system and the laws of jihad, which permit the rape of non-Muslim women in wartime conditions, and this creates a culture of sexual abuse. This is also combined with the disability that non-Muslims and women have before courts of law. They're unable to have their testimony listened to in any case. Often attacks on Christians are not prosecuted. There was a famous case in Egypt some years ago when a whole number of Copts were killed, and when it came to the courts, a few Christians were convicted in relation to the events, but no Muslims were convicted of doing the killing. The bans against witnessing, which sometimes you even see being extended into Western countries. There was a man preaching on the streets in London, and the police came to him and said, "You can't preach here, this is a Muslim area." Apostasy penalties being applied. Restrictions on conversion. In Malaysia, it's incredibly difficult to get your conversion to Christianity accepted by the state. And if you're a woman, you can't marry a Christian man if you're a Muslim woman. So you can't actually marry if you've converted to Christianity in Malaysia. There was a famous case involving a woman called Lena Joy, who wanted to marry a Christian after she became a Christian, but the state says, oh, that's a religious issue, it goes before the Sharia court, and the Sharia court won't recognise the conversion. And indeed, Malaysia will put Christians who've come out of Islam through kind of re-education camps to try and change them back, and it's very difficult for them. They have to really flee the country. There's also the threat of mob violence. If you don't respect Islam, then we will go wild in the streets. Lord Ahmed in London said, if you let Geert Wilders come and speak in Parliament House, there'll be riots on the streets of London. And so the British government banned Geert Wilders from coming and speaking there. He's the leader of a party in Holland. In the end, people took that to court, and the decision of the government was overturned, and he did come and speak. But that's the mentality of the threat of violence that's even working in the West. But it's particularly the case in Muslim majority countries. So we've had many examples in Egypt of churches being destroyed, of oppression of converts, jizya payments being extorted in local communities, abductions of girls, being unable to get them back. Nigeria, the pressure of mob violence, destruction of churches, regular killings, inferiority legislated in Sharia law. The blasphemy code in Pakistan, which causes Christians to live in fear, and the legal vulnerability they have surviving and getting their cases through Sharia courts. In Aceh, some years back, I read a pact for church destruction. The Christian community signed a document saying they would demolish their churches in order to prevent the community from rising up and destroying them. And they did this. It's ironic because the document was said, you know, as a sign of Muslim tolerance, we're permitting you to destroy your churches so that you won't be attacked and killed because we're so concerned for your welfare. and for your safety. So these sorts of things are happening all over the world in Islamic contexts. Now, what can you do about this? In other lectures, I will be explaining some ministry principles, spiritual principles, to help set people free from the fear, the intimidation, the sense of gratitude or vulnerability that comes from these principles. And we've found these prayers to be very powerful and effective in changing people's lives and in releasing them into ministry. And I would encourage anyone who comes from a Christian background who's going into ministry with Muslims to go through prayers and go through this ministry to declare their freedom in Christ and to understand these dynamics as well so they can be bold. But some of the things we need to do is end the silence, the denial about this history. This is a denied history, a suppressed history. Speak up and give practical support to Christians who are living under Islamic rule. We need to pray earnestly for the demolishing of these principalities and powers that stand behind this abuse. We need to insist on the principle of reciprocity with Muslims. Oh, so you'd like to build a mosque in Rome? Well, we would like to build a church in Mecca. Could you please provide a plot of land for us? You know, you're concerned about the treatment of Muslims in Canada. Well, could you please explain why the 500,000 Christians in Saudi Arabia don't have a single church to worship in? Let's have a talk about this reciprocity, and that's a principle that I think we can encourage Muslims to think about. God has made us all. Why can't we treat each other with respect? We need to have confidence and boldness about our faith in Christ. You know, Islam is not a substitute for Christianity. I don't really like the idea of saying we're a family of religions. And this is a very different faith. It has a very different way of establishing its principles. We need to hold love and truth together and not just be truth-focused or love-focused. You need to have both. The people that abandon truth to just embrace love end up being enslaved. And you need both. We also need to boldly claim our healing and our freedom. And I will be explaining a ministry strategy for establishing that. Just to recap, Islam is built on two covenants. There is the covenant of the dhimma for non-Muslims. It's the only option apart from warfare available to non-Muslims, a spiritual surrender involving material support. And there is the covenant of the Shahada, which binds Muslims to the example of Muhammad, and all his spiritual issues, his spiritual infestations, you might say, get passed on through that identification. For Muslims that are coming out of Islam, I ask them to renounce the Shahada, renounce the example of Muhammad, renounce the Sharia, and make a break with all the curses that are associated with that dark covenant. For Christians who are seeking to minister into Islamic contexts, they also need to reject and emphatically renounce the dhimma and all its implications and claim their freedom in Christ. These two work together, and it's quite possible for Christians, even missionaries, and those who have a passionate love for the Lord and a love for Muslims, to come under the influence and the intimidating effects of the dhimma system as well. It's important to bring things into the light so they can be seen clearly for what they are. The scriptures explain this to us several times. There is nothing to be gained by hiding these things. My own personal experience, and I believe it will be key for many people around the world, is that by naming the truth and bringing these things into the light, and then applying the biblical principles of freedom, which I'll be speaking about in the next lectures, or in other lectures in this series, you can then find freedom and be able to be bold and strong and actually have resources in your hands to set people free. And I believe that as the church rises up and claims its freedom, including the churches that have long lived under the dominance of Islam, we will see remarkable things happening in the area of bringing Muslims into freedom, into faith in Christ.